Alright team, here we go again. Time for another episode of the Exceptional Leadership Podcast. And as always, I'm your host, Matt Hamilton. Delighted to have your company for a little bit of a examination on the topic of how to lead under fire as a leader. And if you lead long enough, you're going to experience this. And that is the difficult task of leading people while managing stress in your personal life. Now, the sources of that stress can be all manner of things, and we'll look at that in a bit. The stress source could be from within the workplace itself, but often it will manifest itself in your personal life. And as leaders, we don't have the luxury of succumbing to that stress and staying away from work for long periods of time because we have people who depend on us. We also don't have the luxury of fading into the background and not being in front of people, not being front and center. And that can be difficult if you are in an emotionally negative headspace. But it is something that if we're to lead consistently, we will have to learn to manage. Now, as we always do, let's set the scene by delving into some history. And let's examine a situation where somebody else was able to maintain composure despite some personal tragedy. And the person I speak of is Franklin D. Roosevelt, the President of the United States. And we go back to 1941. Here we go. It was the winter of 1941 and the world was a powder keg. The air thick with the tension of a war that was rapidly expanding. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the President of the United States, was at the helm, navigating not only the complexities of global conflict, but also the delicate balance of guiding a nation through what was an uncertain time. But in the midst of this vast responsibility, he faced a personal tragedy that could have easily overwhelmed a lesser individual. Roosevelt's mother, Sarah Roosevelt, passed away in early 1941. She had been an anchor in his life for decades, a constant source of support and guidance. Her death struck him deeply, leaving a hole in his heart that words couldn't express. Yet in the public eye there was no sign of his grief. The world was watching, and the nation, embroiled in war at that time, needed a leader who could provide strength. Despite the emotional weight of the loss, Roosevelt continued with his duties. The day after his mother's funeral, he was back at work, meeting with his cabinet, making vital decisions about the war, and addressing the American people. His face was a mask of calm, his voice steady, as he outlined the nation's next steps. He knew that any sign of personal weakness could shake the confidence of those who looked to him for direction during such turbulent times. At one of his many press conferences, Roosevelt stood tall, projecting composure as journalists fired questions about the war and its escalating consequences. His answers were sharp, measured, and unflinching. Beneath the surface, though the grief was real, Roosevelt's mastery over his emotions allowed him to compartmentalize the weight of personal sorrow, placing it aside to serve his country. Behind closed doors, Roosevelt would wrestle with his grief, but in public, he was unwavering. He understood that the nation's morale depended on him. In that moment, it wasn't just a president standing before the public, it was a symbol of hope, stability, and resilience. His leadership during this time would come to define him, showing the world that true strength often shines brightest, not in the absence of hardship, but in the ability to face it head on and still lead with unwavering resolve. In the years that followed, as the war raged on and the US faced many more trials, Roosevelt's composure during the loss of his mother became a defining moment in his presidency. It was a testament to the power of leadership, showing that even in the face of personal tragedy, one could still guide a nation through stormy seas. And that is a set of circumstances that is not too far beyond the realm of possibility for all of us. You know, I heard someone say something that I thought was very poignant. She put it in really simple terms. She said, if you're around long enough, you're going to have to walk through something. And I think that's very true. One of the privileges of living for a long time is that you see many different things and experience many different things. But one of the difficult aspects of that is that, of course, the longer you are around, the more likely it is that you're going to lose things that you love. Now, that is probably one of the more extreme examples of a circumstance whereby you might have to lead through stress. But it doesn't have to be that extreme. It could be something as simple as the kids kept you up all night. Maybe your partner snores, didn't get a good night's sleep, but you still have to turn up to work the next day despite your fatigue and lead with composure, maturity, and wisdom. And as leaders, we are front and center, aren't we? We don't have the luxury of drifting along in the background without getting in front of our people, because our job is to create the visions and build the belief in our team and impart our energy and enthusiasm onto those that we lead to help bring them along on those journeys. We have to be the individual who coaches people through difficult times, who is a sounding board for negative emotion. Leading people is complex. Oftentimes you do have to deal with heightened emotions, and that takes a personal toll. And maybe there will be days where you have to take on board all that negativity and work through people problems, despite having a difficult emotional makeup on that particular day yourself. In fact, it's not a maybe, it's a guarantee if you're around long enough. Now, as I said, Mr. Roosevelt's situation there is a particularly difficult one. Losing a loved one and then having to lead afterwards, despite still being in a grieving state, is an incredibly difficult thing to do. But given the grieving process doesn't resolve itself overnight, if you're unfortunate enough to find yourself in that circumstance, as I'm sure many of you listening have, you are possibly going to have to lead for an extended period of time while dealing with those difficult emotions. And what that means is that we need to have a good poker face. We need to develop the ability to compartmentalize our sadness, our grief, our negative emotions, whatever they may be, so as not to damage the confidence of the team, remembering that those people look to us for strength and stability. And if we can compartmentalize, We also have to be careful that we're still processing and dealing with those difficult emotions in our own time, so as not to let the pressure build up to the point where we are eventually unable to lead effectively. This goes back to previous episodes where I spoke about learning to growl. It's a very similar concept. We're not talking about growling in this episode. We're talking about processing emotion, however. And so you can apply the same theory. Emotion needs to be expressed, whether it's negative or positive. And so whatever your negative emotion may be, whether it's anger or sadness or anxiety, it will express itself in some way. And so while you're putting on a poker face, despite dealing with personal tragedy or other emotionally negative circumstances, while you might be able to effectively do that, potentially for prolonged periods of time, you need to make sure that you utilize the pressure relief valve that we spoke about in our episode Learn to Growl a few episodes back now. The same theory applies here. You have to give yourself that respite and allow yourself that outlet when it's safe to do so, so that you can continue to operate effectively without that emotional pressure build-up. As leaders, we have to show up and do our jobs while leading through pain. Now, thankfully, it's likely not going to be often that we have to lead through personal tragedy, but as I said, if you are around long enough, you will eventually have to walk through something that is similar. Now, the reason that I chose this topic today is because for me, it's a very relevant one. Sadly, we had to bid farewell to a much loved member of our family only yesterday morning as I record this podcast. And that was our cat, George. Now, George, he was only 7, which makes it even sadder. Not old for a cat. But he was a very valued member of our family. My wife and I don't have children, so George really acted as our first child in many ways. He was the first thing that my wife and I had responsibility for as far as another being goes. And over that 7 years, we got to know him. He became a part of our family, and he became a part of our everyday routine. He was the first thing that I would seek out in the morning and the last thing that I would seek out before I went to bed. And when you develop a bond with someone or something, as in a pet, over a prolonged period of time, it's a tremendously disruptive and sad thing to have to make the decision to part ways with your companion. And that is what we had to do. He fell ill, and then over a period of a couple of months, unfortunately, degenerated to the point where we had to make that call. Now, the reason this topic is relevant, the reason that anecdote is relevant for the topic discussed today, is that when I found out that we were going to have to make that decision, when I found out that there was nothing else that could be done and we were in fact going to lose him, it was just after lunchtime on a Wednesday afternoon. And I had about 3 hours of back-to-back meetings scheduled after lunch. So you can imagine especially those of you who have pets and understand how close a bond you can have with them, and particularly if you've experienced what it's like to have any of them put down, you can imagine the sadness that I felt upon learning that news, after focusing on the positive, after holding hope for 2 months that we would be able to get him back on track, only to have it all come crashing down in what seemed like a short few days as things became clear. So I got that news just before having to lead 3 back-to-back meetings where I was going to have to speak in front of the team and other teams, maintain a positive, professional disposition, and essentially put on that mask that we spoke of. And I can tell you, it was an incredibly difficult thing to do. You know, it was one of those strange situations where the news is terrible enough to have a dramatic psychological impact on you. But leaving for the day at that point, upon receiving that news, wouldn't have achieved anything. So it was a balance of taking care of myself, but also understanding what my team's needs were. And the difficult decision that I had to make was, do I carry on for the rest of the day despite a rapidly deteriorating emotional state? Or do I leave? And what would be the impact on the team if I was to leave? And I deemed it important enough that as a professional, I needed to continue on for the second half of the day and lead all of those meetings in a professional and composed manner. And I did that. I've always been lucky that I have a reasonably good poker face. People find it difficult to tell that I'm upset. And that's probably in part a little bit of nature, but it's also due to nurture and practice. And so I led for the rest of the day. And then, when the end of the day came and those meetings were done, I was able to release some of that emotion. When the work was done, I was able to release some of that emotion, release the pressure valve, so to speak, and make the decision that it would probably be best if I didn't come into work on the Thursday and the Friday, so that we could have the procedure completed with George, our beloved cat, and so that I could be there to process the emotions that we needed to process as a family. And this brings me onto the nuance aspect of this topic. We've just covered the importance of being able to lead through adversity and lead through situations where you're having to put a mask on, essentially. You're having to quell those feelings of sadness and lead in a manner that would make people think everything's fine. And that's true. You do have to have that ability. Absolutely. But also, you have to understand, and this is crucial, you have to understand when to bench yourself. And this ties all the way back into episode 14, where we spoke about knowing yourself, knowing your personality. I knew that on that Wednesday afternoon, I could get through it. I knew myself well enough to know that I could get through those meetings and show up for my team, and then make the call at the end of the day that I needed the rest of the week to make the appropriate arrangements and begin the healing process. But the point of this is that I didn't always have such good judgment. As a younger leader, and I'm sure many of you have potentially experienced this personality trait as well, I had a tendency to redline myself. It's only been a relatively recent development that I've learned to treat myself a little more kindly. And we all need to do that. Treating myself kindly was getting through the Wednesday and then taking the Thursday and Friday as personal leave to deal with things in such a manner that was kind to myself and my family, by giving myself the space to do what we needed to do in the face of that loss. There was a time where I probably wouldn't have done that, because I had the view that work was everything and I needed to make sure that I showed up and put others before myself. But the problem with that is that if you break yourself, you're no good to anybody. And so we need to find this dichotomy between leading with strength and putting on the mask and showing up for other people and doing your job in a professional manner, but not to the extent that you redline and the wheels fall off, because it's not sustainable. And it's a difficult balance to find. Nevertheless, it's one that we need to achieve. And I do believe it's something that we need to ideally learn without getting to the point where we learn the hard way and we experience what it's like to have the wheels fall off. You are no good to your team, yourself, or the organization if you allow yourself to get to that point. So guys, I hope that helps. I'm sure that many of you listening can think back to a situation where you've had to lead while under fire, while in an emotionally negative headspace for whatever reason. And it is likely, as I said, that as leaders, you'll probably experience the full gamut if you're around long enough. But know when to bench yourself and know when to continue on performing your duties. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about the topic of knowing yourself, head back to episode 14 and explore that a little bit more. Guys, I hope that helps. Thank you so much for joining me. As I always do, I'll direct your attention to the show notes where we have a little link that says send us a text. And I would love to have your feedback. I would love to hear about the challenges that you are experiencing as a part of your leadership journey. Perhaps you have a question that you'd like to ask me and we could address it on the show. Be more than happy to have that engagement with you. So use that resource. It is there for you guys. Don't be shy. As I always say, if you would be so kind, leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast app that you consume this show on. And before we finish, let's take a moment to remember all the fallen good boys. See you next time.